On a January morning in 2003, near Anchorage, Alaska, a freight train carrying lumber and mining equipment left the tracks at 41 degrees below zero. The derailment happened at 4:17 a.m. on a stretch of track that parallels the old Seward Highway, where the Alaska Railroad cuts through spruce forest and crosses frozen wetlands on its way south from the port. 3 cars went over, one tipped completely onto its side, another jackknifed across both rails. The third hung at a sickening angle, half on the embankment, half suspended over a drainage culvert that had been frozen solid since November. The railroad sent engineers. They sent supervisors. They sent equipment operators with Caterpillar excavators and mobile cranes rated for Arctic conditions. By 9 a.m., they'd made a decision. Nothing functions below -30, the lead engineer said. His name was Derek Haas, and he'd been with Alaska Railroad for 11 years. He stood in the snow with a clipboard and a radio, watching his breath freeze into crystals that hung in the air like fog. We wait for a warming trend, 2, maybe 3 days. Then we bring in the heavy equipment and do this right. The crew didn't argue. It was 41 below. Metal became brittle. Hydraulic fluid thickened to paste. Diesel gelled in fuel lines. Engines that started fine at 0 refused to turn over at 40 below. This was Alaska in deep winter, and the cold made its own rules. That's when the 1948 Kenworth showed up. Let me tell you about Otto Schmidt, because you need to understand the man before you understand what he did. Otto was 83 years old. He'd been in Alaska since 1946, back when it was still a territory, back when Anchorage was a railroad town of maybe 30,000 people, and the highway to Fairbanks was gravel all the way. He'd come north after the war, served in the Aleutian Campaign, decided he liked the cold and the silence and the kind of country where a man's value was measured by what he could do, not what he said. He worked pipeline jobs, did recovery work for bush pilots, pulled trucks out of ditches on the Richardson Highway when it was still called the Alaska-Canada Military Highway. In 1950, Otto bought a 1948 Kenworth 524 wrecker from a freight company in Fairbanks that was upgrading to newer equipment. Paid $1,800 cash. The Kenworth was already 2 years old, already modified for Arctic work with dual-fuel filters, hand-drapped fuel line insulation, and a custom-built engine block heater that ran off a wood-fired boiler. Otto kept that truck running for 53 years. He modified it further, added permafrost anchoring brackets welded to the frame, installed a backup fuel tank with a gravity feed system that wouldn't freeze, learned cold start techniques from Iditarod mushers and uranium prospectors who operated in the Brooks Range in winter. By 2003, the Kenworth was more Otto's creation than Kenworth's, a machine built by decades of Alaskan problem-solving. People in Anchorage knew the truck. Dark green cab, cream-colored boom, Schmidt Recovery painted in white letters on the door. It was a relic. It belonged in a museum. Otto belonged in a rocking chair. But Otto still answered calls. On the morning of January 14, 2003, Otto heard about the derailment on his police scanner. He listened to the railroad engineers discussing temperature thresholds and equipment limitations. He listened to them decide to wait. He put on his parka, started the Kenworth. It fired on the second try and drove to the site. The railroad crew saw him coming. They heard the engine first, a deep, uneven rumble that didn't sound like any modern diesel. Then they saw the truck itself, a boxy, old-fashioned wrecker with a boom that looked like it belonged on a 1940s construction site, not a 21st century railroad recovery. Derek Haas walked over as Otto climbed down from the cab. "Site's closed," Derek said, not rude, just factual. "Insurance liability, we're not operating until temperatures rise." "I heard," Otto said. His voice was quiet, roughened by decades of Arctic air. "Thought I might be able to help." Derek looked at the Kenworth, looked at Otto, looked back at the Kenworth. "With that, she's pulled heavier," Otto said. Derek didn't laugh. He was too professional for that, but his expression said everything his mouth didn't. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but we are dealing with a 70-ton rail car at -41. Our Caterpillar 330 won't even start. Hydraulic fluid's too thick. We've got a mobile crane on standby in Wasilla, but the operator won't risk the equipment until it warms up. Your Caterpillar runs on hydraulics, Otto said. Hydraulics freeze, mine doesn't. What does yours run on? Cables, chains, gears, same things that worked in 1948. Derek shook his head slowly. That truck's got to be, 55 years old? 55 years of Alaska, Otto said. She knows the cold. One of the other engineers, a younger man named Kyle, walked up. He'd been listening. You're seriously saying a 1948 wrecker can pull a derailed freight car that our modern equipment can't touch? I'm saying modern equipment quits when it gets cold, Otto said. Mine doesn't know how to quit. Kyle laughed, not mean, just disbelieving. This I gotta see. Derek sighed. He looked at the derailed train, looked at his idle Caterpillar, looked at his crew standing around with nothing to do. You touch that rail car and something goes wrong, it's on you. Railroad's not liable. Understood, Otto said. And if your truck breaks down out here, we're not towing it. Won't need towing. Derek stepped aside. Go ahead then, show us how it's done. Otto walked back to the Kenworth. The crew watched. A few pulled out phones to record. This was either going to be a rescue or a disaster, and either way, it was worth filming. Let me tell you about the 1948 Kenworth 524, because understanding the machine is the only way to understand what happened next. The 524 was Kenworth's heavy-duty wrecker model, built in the late 1940s for recovery work in extreme conditions. It had an inline-six engine, a 4-speed manual transmission, and a mechanically driven winch system with no hydraulics, no computers, no electronic controls. Just steel cable, gear reduction, and a hand-operated clutch. The boom was built from riveted steel I-beams, tall and narrow, designed to lift heavy loads vertically without tipping the truck. The rear axle was a dual-wheel setup with a differential lock that could be engaged manually with a floor lever. Otto's modifications made it even tougher. He'd wrapped every fuel line in heat tape and canvas insulation. He'd installed a secondary fuel tank with a wood-burning heating element that kept diesel from gelling even at 60 below. He'd welded permafrost anchoring points to the frame, steel plates with holes drilled through them. Designed to be staked into frozen ground to keep the truck from shifting under heavy load. Most importantly, Otto had learned something that modern operators had forgotten: cold start technique. In Alaska, you don't just turn a key and expect an engine to fire at 40 below. You preheat, you circulate warm oil through the block, you prime the fuel system manually, you use ether sparingly, only as a last resort, and you never, ever rush. Otto had started that Kenworth in colder temperatures than this, 50 below, 60 below. Once, in 1955, he'd started it at 68 below on the Yukon River ice during a rescue operation that saved 3 bush pilots whose plane had gone through thin ice. 41 below was nothing. He positioned the Kenworth about 60 feet from the derailed freight car, on solid ground where the permafrost ran deep. He climbed out, walked slowly around the derailment, studying angles. The railcar was tipped at about 30 degrees, resting on its side with the undercarriage partially buried in snow. The center of gravity had shifted. Righting it would require rotational force, not just vertical lift. Otto walked back to the Kenworth and began setting up. First, the anchors. He pulled 4 steel stakes from a toolbox bolted to the truck's running board, each stake 3 feet long, tapered to a point, with a D-ring welded to the top. He drove them into the frozen ground at 45-degree angles using a hand sledge, spacing them in a wide rectangle behind the truck. Then he ran chains from the stakes to the Kenworth's frame anchoring points. The chains weren't for pulling, they were for holding the truck in place when the load tried to drag it backward. Next, the boom. Otto extended it manually, hand-cranking a gear system that raised the I-beam tower to its full height. No hydraulics, no power assist, just gears and a ratchet lock. He unspooled steel cable from the main winch drum, thick as a man's thumb, and walked it across the snow to the derailed freight car. He hooked it to the car's frame at a calculated point, low enough to generate rotational torque, high enough to avoid the buried wheels. The railroad crew watched in silence now. No jokes, no phones, just watching. Derek Haas stood with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Otto walked back to the Kenworth, climbed into the cab, and engaged the winch clutch. The cable went taut. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Kenworth sat there, engine idling, exhaust vapor rising in the frozen air. The freight car didn't move. Then Otto shifted the winch into low gear. The sound was different from a modern hydraulic winch. Deeper, slower, a grinding, mechanical rhythm that felt patient rather than forceful. The cable stretched, not breaking, just settling under load. The Kenworth's frame groaned as the anchor chains took tension. The boom creaked. And the freight car moved. Not much, an inch, maybe two, but it moved. Kyle, the younger engineer, took a step forward. Holy. The freight car rotated. Slowly, incrementally, the wheels began to lift from the snow. The angle decreased, 30 degrees, 25. Otto kept the winch turning, steady, patient, no sudden force, just constant mechanical pull. 20 degrees, 15. The railcar's center of gravity passed the tipping point. Suddenly, its own weight was working with Otto, not against him. It fell the rest of the way onto its wheels with a heavy thud that shook the ground and sent up a cloud of snow. Upright. The crew erupted, men shouted, someone clapped, Kyle actually jumped. Derek Haas stood absolutely still, staring at the freight car, then at the Kenworth, then at Otto climbing down from the cab. Otto unhooked the cable without ceremony, cranked the boom back down, pulled up the anchor stakes, coiled the chains, methodical, unhurried. Derek walked over. How, Derek said, our equipment. Your equipment's designed to protect itself, Otto said. Sensors cut power when things get too hard. Hydraulics freeze when it gets too cold. Computers won't let operators exceed safe limits. He patted the Kenworth's fender. This truck doesn't know what's safe. It just pulls. But the cold. The cold's not the enemy, Otto said. Impatience is. I spent 2 hours preheating this engine before I drove out here, warmed the oil, cleared the fuel lines, took my time. Derek looked at the ground. When he looked back up, his expression had changed. I owe you, he said. Name your price. No charge, Otto said, just doing what the truck was built for. There's got to be something. Otto thought for a moment. Railroad Museum in Anchorage. They're trying to restore a 1940s rotary snowplow. Donate whatever you think is fair. Derek pulled out his phone, made a call, and within 10 minutes had authorized a $15,000 donation. Otto nodded once, climbed into the Kenworth, and started the engine. As he drove away, Kyle turned to Derek. What the hell just happened? An old man with an old truck did what $250,000 of modern equipment couldn't do, Derek said quietly. That's what happened. Let me tell you what happened in the weeks after, because that's when the real story began to unfold. The railroad crew couldn't stop talking about it. Word spread through Alaska Railroad's maintenance division, then to the dispatchers, then to the executive offices in Anchorage. By the end of January, Otto Schmidt's name was being mentioned in operational meetings as the contractor who saved the Seward Line recovery. But Otto didn't care about recognition. He went back to his shop, a corrugated metal building on the outskirts of Anchorage that he'd built himself in 1952. The building had no sign, no advertising, just a gravel driveway and a roll-up door that opened onto a workspace filled with 50 years of accumulated tools, parts, and mechanical wisdom. Otto had always been methodical about maintenance. Every piece of equipment he owned was serviced on a schedule that existed only in his head. He knew when to change oil, when to grease fittings, when to inspect cables. The Kenworth was no different. 3 weeks after the derailment, Otto was performing his annual winter service on the truck. He drained fluids, checked bearings, inspected the winch drum for wear. And then he decided to do something he rarely did, completely drain and flush the custom Arctic fuel tank. The tank was one of Otto's own modifications, built in 1963 after a particularly brutal winter when standard fuel systems had failed him twice. He'd fabricated it from welded steel plate, installed a wood-fired heating element beneath it, and routed the fuel lines through an insulated channel that ran along the frame rail. He'd used that tank for 40 years without issue, never had a reason to take it apart. But on this day, something told him to check it thoroughly. He unbolted the tank from its mounting brackets, flipped it over on his workbench, and began removing the drain plug. The fuel ran out clean, no sediment, no water contamination. Good. Then he noticed something odd. The tank's interior depth didn't match its exterior dimensions. He measured. Outside depth, 14 inches. Inside depth, 12 inches. 2 inches unaccounted for. Otto tapped the bottom of the tank with a wrench handle. The sound changed halfway across, from solid steel to something hollow. A false bottom. He spent the next hour carefully cutting through the welds that sealed the hidden compartment. When the plate finally came free, Otto found himself staring at something he'd never expected. Inside, protected by oilcloth and sealed in a military surplus ammunition box, 3 hand-drawn maps on heavy linen paper dated 1937 showing the Aleutian Islands and Bristol Bay. The maps were marked with Russian annotations, fur trading routes, supply cache locations, meeting points along the coast. The detail was extraordinary. Whoever had drawn these maps knew the territory intimately. $6,000 in U.S. currency, nothing newer than 1946. The bills were mostly 20s and 50s, bundled with rotted rubber bands. Alongside them, Canadian dollars from the same era. And 11 pieces of carved walrus ivory, each about 4 inches long, intricately decorated with Cyrillic initials and what looked like family crests. The kind of ivory that hadn't been legally tradable in decades. Otto sat down on his shop stool and stared at the contents spread across his workbench. The Kenworth had been built in Seattle in 1948. Otto had bought it in 1950 from a freight company in Fairbanks called Volkov and Sons Transportation. He remembered the transaction clearly. The company was liquidating assets after the owner's death, selling everything to pay estate taxes. The owner's name had been Sergei Volkov. Otto had never thought much about it. Volkov was a common enough Russian name in Alaska. Plenty of immigrants had come north during the territorial days, either fleeing the Soviet Union or chasing opportunities in a place where a man's past didn't matter as much as his work ethic. But now, looking at these maps and this currency and this ivory, Otto realized that Sergei Volkov's story had been more complicated than he'd ever known. He spent the next week doing research. The Anchorage Public Library had archives of old newspapers. Otto found a 1949 obituary for Sergei Volkov, age 63, owner of a freight business in Fairbanks, survived by no immediate family. The obituary mentioned that Volkov had emigrated from Russia in 1933 and had worked as a fur trader before starting his transportation company. Otto dug deeper. He found shipping records showing that Volkov and Sons had contracted with the U.S. military during World War II, hauling supplies to remote radar stations and weather observation posts along the Aleutian chain. Dangerous work. Volkov had owned 3 trucks. The Kenworth 524 had been his personal vehicle, the one he drove himself on the longest, coldest routes. Then Otto found something that made the hidden cache make sense. A 1938 newspaper article from the Nome Nugget, reporting that a man named Sergei Volkov had been questioned by federal agents investigating smuggling operations, along the Bering Sea coast. The article said Volkov had been cleared of wrongdoing, but that investigators believed illegal ivory and furs were being moved through Russian-American trading networks that dated back to before the Bolshevik Revolution. Volkov, it seemed, had been connected to the old world, the world of Tsarist Russia, of fur empires, of relationships and debts that transcended borders and governments. The maps, the currency, the ivory, they weren't stolen goods. They were insurance, a portable fortune hidden in the one asset Volkov trusted most, his truck. If the government came asking questions, if creditors closed in, if the political situation changed, Volkov could disappear into the Alaskan bush with everything he needed to start over hidden in a fuel tank that no one would think to search. But Volkov had died in 1949, and his secrets had died with him. Until Otto found them 54 years later. Let me tell you what Otto did with that discovery, because it says everything about the kind of man he was. He could have kept the money. $6,000 in 1940s currency was worth more than that now, maybe 10 or 12,000 to collectors. The ivory alone, even with legal restrictions, had value to museums and historical societies. But Otto didn't think of it as his. He contacted the Anchorage Museum, explained what he'd found, and donated the maps. The museum's curator was astonished. The maps filled in gaps in the historical record of Russian-American trade networks, providing detail that scholars had been searching for decades. The currency Otto kept not to spend, but as a historical curiosity. He framed a few of the bills and hung them in his shop, a reminder of Sergei Volkov and the secret life that had traveled thousands of miles in a hidden compartment beneath Otto's boots for half a century. The ivory presented a legal problem. Federal law prohibited the sale of walrus ivory harvested after 1972, but these pieces clearly predated that cutoff. Otto worked with a registered dealer who specialized in native Alaskan artifacts and antique ivory. The pieces were authenticated, documented, and sold legally to collectors and museums. Otto used the money, $14,000 after fees, to establish a scholarship fund at the University of Alaska Anchorage for students studying mechanical engineering or transportation technology. He named it the Sergei Volkov Memorial Scholarship. Volkov built something that lasted, Otto told the university administrator who helped set up the fund. Figured his name should be attached to something that keeps lasting. The Kenworth stayed in Otto's garage. He drove it for 6 more years, until 2009, when he was 89, and his son Richard finally convinced him to stop working. "You're going to kill yourself out there," Richard said. "You're almost 90, you can't be crawling under trucks in the snow anymore." "Truck still runs," Otto said. "That's not the point." Otto looked at the Kenworth, sitting in the shop where it had sat for 59 years. Dark green cab, cream boom, Schmidt recovery in fading white paint. "All right," he said finally, "but the truck doesn't get scrapped. Find it a place." Richard found it a place. The Alaska Museum of Transportation and Industry in Wasilla had been trying to acquire a vintage wrecker for their heavy equipment collection. When they heard that Otto Schmidt's 1948 Kenworth was available, they drove to Anchorage the same day. The museum restored the truck carefully, keeping Otto's modifications intact. They built a dedicated display around it, with photographs of Otto, documentation of the 2003 derailment recovery, and a detailed explanation of the Arctic adaptations that had kept the truck running for 6 decades. The plaque reads, 1948, Kenworth 524 wrecker. Owner Otto Schmidt, 1952-009. This machine worked in Alaska for 61 years and never failed in the cold. Otto Schmidt died on March 8, 2011, at the age of 91. His funeral was held at Holy Family Cathedral in Anchorage, and the church was full. Railroad workers came, bush pilots came, tow truck operators from across the state came. Derek Haas and Kyle, The engineers from the 2003 derailment sat in the third row. The eulogy was given by Otto's son, Richard, who told stories about growing up in a house that smelled like diesel and grease, about learning to weld before he learned to drive, about watching his father solve problems that other men said were impossible. "My dad didn't believe in impossible," Richard said. "He believed in patient work. He believed in understanding how things actually function, not how people say they function. And he believed that a good machine, properly maintained, will outlast the man who built it, and the man who bought it, and the man who said it was obsolete." After the funeral, Derek Haas stood outside the church with Kyle, both of them older now, both of them quiet. "I think about that day sometimes," Kyle said. "The derailment, watching him pull that railcar with a truck that was older than my father." "I think about it too," Derek said. "What do you think about?" Derek was quiet for a moment. "I think about how sure I was that it couldn't be done, how certain I was that modern equipment was better, how I looked at that old man and that old truck and thought, this is a waste of time." He looked at Kyle, and I think about how completely wrong I was. They stood there for a while longer, watching people file out of the church, and then they drove to Wasilla. They wanted to see the Kenworth one more time. At the museum, they stood in front of the truck for a long time without speaking. The dark green cab, the cream boom, the Schmidt recovery lettering, the welded anchoring points, the custom fuel tank that had held a secret for 54 years. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a railroad spike. He set it on the truck's running board. "What's that for?" Kyle asked. "Respect," Derek said. And every year since then, on January 14th, someone from Alaska Railroad drives to the museum and leaves another spike. The tradition has spread. Tow operators leave chains, bush pilots leave propeller bolts, mechanics leave old wrenches. The running board is covered now with small offerings, tokens of respect from people who understand what Otto Schmidt proved on a frozen morning in 2003. That some machines don't quit when the temperature drops. They just wait for someone who knows how to start them. And some men don't retire when the world says they're too old. They just keep pulling until the job is done.